McLaren has apparently facelifted the McLaren GT. It's now called the GTS. I have some issues finding what the new changes are, what the changes are on the exterior design, but under the hood we do have some changes. What we're gonna do in this video is you're gonna help me out here, because you need to tell me what you see is different on the new GTS compared to the GT when we compare it from a front, side, rear. The interior is pretty much the same. We do have some new trim levels or some new trims and materials in there, but other than that it's pretty much the exact same car. I filmed a in-person review of the McLaren GT if you want to go and check that out, and the redesign that I did for that car, you can go and check that out on the Sketch Monkey channel. I'm gonna link that down below. And Rosie is trying to punch my face right now, not sure why. Before I jump into Photoshop here and compare this design, and as I said, you need to help me out and see what's new with this. Let's have a look at what's actually new under the hood of the new 2024, I believe, GTS. So like its predecessor, the GTS aims to be a more luxurious supercar. The GTS, which is essentially a facelifted version of the GT. They say they have a new bumper in the rear here, but I've already looked at the old one and I can't see any big differences here. The 2025 McLaren GTS features the same twin-turbo 4-liter V8, but now puts out 626 horsepower, which is a bump of 14 horsepower. And when I drove the McLaren GT, looked at it, looked like a very fast car, not supercar proportions. It's more, as they say, a luxurious GT supercar. I did not expect it to be as quick as it was. It's insanely fast. There are also new colors. You have new wheels, and we're going to talk about the wheels here as well and what I think of those, and also interior trim options. Produces 626 horsepower, a 14 horsepower bump over the GT, but you have the same amount of torque at 465 pound-feet. The company says that it will do 0 to 60 in 3.1 seconds, but here Car and Driver tested it and it did in 2.8 seconds, which is a substantial improvement over the official numbers. We have a reshaped front bumper, and I do see a couple of changes here, and a slight changes to the rear fenders. There is also more gloss black trim, which I'm happy to see, specifically here around the greenhouse. Instead of having it be chrome, it's now black, which I definitely prefer on this car. Plus new wheel options, including the stunning 10-spoke turbine wheels. And those are the wheels that I'm not a huge fan of. I'm gonna let you know why, and also compare it to the old ones, why I prefer the old style wheels. McLaren also says that the visual changes are functional, in McLaren fashion obviously, with the larger front air intakes and the resculpted rear end, allowing more air to flow into the radiator and the engine. We also have a new front axle lift system, which is a lot faster than before. Deliveries is expected to begin in 2024, and the pricing, you can suppose it's going to be around this number right here, $210,000. So with that said, let's jump in here to Photoshop, have a look at the new and the old one. So starting out with the front end, can you see something different here? I can definitely see a little bit of changes in the front end bumper, but the main problem that I had with the McLaren GT when it first came out is still intact in the GTS. The reason why I wanted to do a redesign for this is, if you look at this, we're gonna have a look at in a minute. If you look at it from a side view, and I talked about this in my review as well, where I also did the redesign, is that I think the front end just sits a little, like a couple of inches too high, and you can clearly see what I'm talking about in a side view. So I'm not gonna talk much about that right now, but we have the new front end bumper here. We still have the same style of air intakes in the front lower section. I like this design because it has a lot of organic feeling to it. You have this beautiful intake here with this wing that has a lot of organic feeling to it because it has a lot of radiuses going on, so it has a nice flow to it. And in addition to that, we also have this C shape that is typical for McLaren to have this design right here cutting into the to the headlight. The headlight itself on the new one, let's focus on the new one here. It looks a little, maybe a little too simplistic for me, because there's no dynamic feeling in the LED, the daytime run light. It's just one single strip like this with the same thickness all around from the very beginning to the very end. Still has one single thickness to it, and it makes for a bit of a static look. We could maybe have a bit different thickness, so let's do something like this and see what this would look like. For example, if we just had this line cutting in, and then in this corner right here, it got just a little bit thicker. So something like this to just add some sort of dynamic vibe to this front end design. Everything else is very dynamic in here, and I like that I want to add a little bit of different thicknesses in a key part that is the daytime unlight like this. But they didn't do that, so let's remove that and go back to the standard car. As I said, there are a couple of differences here that you can clearly see when you look at the front end. For example, the main difference being this piece. You have now a added, I think this probably, it looks definitely like carbon fiber piece here. The kind of, I guess it's for funneling air better into this intake, and this is a piece that we did not have in the 2020 GT. Other than that, I'm not so sure. This looks exactly the same. We have this, you see this line, how this cuts in here? We have the same cut right here. So I do believe that this midsection is actually the exact same piece. I could be wrong, but from a visual standpoint, it definitely looks to be exactly the same. We also have the same splitter down here on the corners like we have in the 2020. Now looking at the side view here, and this is where you can see, I don't know if you see the same things as I do, obviously, but when I look at this from a side view and just tweak the design a little bit and just brought it down, just bring it down a couple of, maybe just 1 or 1.5 inch, because that creates a much smoother curvature and doesn't look like, as I said in the review video, that maybe not so popular. When you have the front end sitting this high, it has the exact same problem that I had with the C8 Corvette. And it reminds me a lot, the proportions reminds me a lot of the C8 Corvette, because we do have this front end sitting too high for a McLaren. It might suit a Corvette, it does not suit a McLaren. So here we have the new wheels. You can see these here, turbine wheels, and what I think is missing here, and the reason why I prefer the old ones, the GT wheels, is because this just looks a lot more classy. First of all, just have a simple design like this. This is supposed to be a luxurious supercar, a GT supercar. So I don't want to mess around too much with the design of the wheels. And having them like this in an angle, it makes it look just cheaper. That's reason number one why I prefer the old ones. They just have much more of a classy vibe to them. The second reason is we don't have what I need to see in a wheel like this. I need to have a framing around it. I don't want these spokes to just be dangling by themselves without any sort of foundation. So what I want to do is just add a border like this to house all the spokes and have them have a home or a connection to the outside of the wheel, and that's also something that is intact in the 2020. If you just take a look at the design here, compare it to without this ring or rim around it, I just think it looks a lot better with it on there. Pretty sure I would switch out the wheels in this case if I were to get a 2024 or 2025 McLaren GTS. But other than that, other than the front end that we have here sitting a little too high and the wheels in the new one not being to my personal taste, I think it's a stunning design. It has this classic mid-engine proportions where you have the top of this curvature just like we want, the top peak sitting right above the front axle, creating a nice sculptured house for the front axle. We have a big muscle in the rear end here as well, dipping down into a stunning ducktail in the rear with this cut, and then we have very simplistic taillights that I love in the McLaren GTS. We also have this supposedly new bumper, but look at this. Do you see any changes specifically here from a side view before we have a look at the rear view? I don't see any changes in the design of this area for the new one, but as I said, maybe they did a couple of tweaks that I'm not able to see in this case. I also like this absolutely massive air intake that we have on the side, and this was also something that was a lot bigger than I thought when I saw it in real life. And here you have this chrome trim piece that goes around the window on the 2020 GT, but on the 2025 GTS, it is now blacked out, which, as I said, looks, in my opinion, a lot better. You can probably get it in chrome still, but I definitely prefer it to be blacked out. Now, looking at the rear view, this is by far the best view, or a 3/4 rear view, a little lower than this, the best view for the McLaren GT and the GTS, because it just looks so almost evil with these taillights that sit so deep within here. You can see it in a side view like we talked about. They sit way in here in this carved out portion, and then we have just two simplistic LEDs, and I'm not sure in this case, here the LEDs look maybe a little thinner than what they are in the new GTS. I'm not sure if they actually switched those out, I can't tell, but other than that, everything else looks almost identical to the 2020 GT, I can't see any differences except maybe this mesh that we have in this area is now a different type or style of mesh in the 2025, but I'm not sure if that even a detail worth mentioning. Other than that, it's a fantastic looking rear end. We have this carbon fiber diffuser back here, two exhaust pipes symmetrically positioned and a little bit of an oval feel to them, looking fantastic. But again, my favorite design feature on the GTS and the GT is definitely this area where you have the housing for this very slim taillights, looking gorgeous. Last but not least, as I said, there's really nothing new here in the interior, and I actually like what McLaren is doing with their interiors to take away a lot of the distractions, because just look at how simplistic and almost minimalistic this interior is. And usually I'm not too big a fan of that because it feels very sterile, but in this case McLaren has managed to make interiors that doesn't have a lot of distractions to them and feels very minimalistic without having, you know, this sterile feel, because we have a lot of styling going on. For example, have a look at this styling for the housing of the infotainment screen, and yes, we do have most settings inside of this screen that we have in the middle, but look at the size of this screen. Why do we need any bigger screens than this? Can't remember how big this screen. It looks like maybe an 8-inch, maybe even a 9-inch. It's not a 15-inch screen that sits on the dash, because it's not necessary to have that big of a screen. This is perfectly fine for me. We do have a couple of buttons at the very bottom. It looks like the fan speed here, maybe some climate control buttons here, I'm not sure. And then we have this big home button in the middle. But you can see that the lower section here feels like it is dedicated to the climate control settings. Beautifully sculpted all over. We have some round organic features in here. The wheel itself, not a single button on the steering wheel. And how common is that today? You rarely see this type of steering wheel. It's just a wheel. All you can do with it is just steer the car. You also have these big paddles right behind it in metal, looking fantastic. And we have a housing, beautiful housing for the gauge cluster. This might be a 12.3-inch gauge cluster right there. We have this illuminated piece that sits right here on the passenger side. Nothing really to do for the passenger, just along to enjoy the ride. And you definitely gonna enjoy the ride when you're sitting in a McLaren GTS, that's for sure. I also love how this is integrated in the door. So we have this line, see how this line then continues and wraps in to being part of the dash. So it looks like it's one single piece, the door cutting in and coming into the dash. I think it's a beautiful approach to connecting those two elements of the interior of the McLaren GT and GTS. Down low, we do have some more physical buttons down here, and the drive mode being positioned right here in the center with, of course, you need to have a cup holder or two if you're gonna create a GT car, even though it is a supercar from McLaren. So overall, I don't think it's necessary for McLaren to really update the design of the GT, because it's already such a stunning design. I do wish they would have lowered the front end nose point a little bit by a couple of inches, but I think that's too much of a substantial structural redesign to just make it a facelift. That's probably hopefully going to happen for the next generation GT. McLaren just keeps on crushing their designs, and they're definitely found their own identity when it comes to design language.